Hi, this is Bob Wells here, and welcome to Undercurrent Stories. This is the show where we hear about people's interests and uncover some fascinating stories at the same time. In today's show, we welcome back historian Bill Cunningham, and we discuss the Georgian period in British history, a period that lasted 120 years and which we attempt to cover bite-size in just over half an hour. If your knowledge of the Georgians is limited, perhaps you conjure up images of Jane Austen novels, characters like Mr Darcy, or towns such as Bath or Royal Leamington Spa, this show is definitely for you. I hope that you enjoy the show. Welcome back to the show, Bill.
Good morning, Bob.
Bill, before we get into the subject, can you tell us a little bit more about how you became interested in the Georgians?
Well, I've always been a very keen history buff, amateur history buff, and I got particularly interested in the Georgians when I started working at a local stately home called Grimsthorpe Castle, and obviously have to take people around on tours within the castle. Large parts of it relate to the Georgians. The whole family history during this 18th century, they were Dukes of Ancaster at the time, and the entire frontage is a great, huge 1720s frontage, even though it does lead on to a Tudor property. And once you start digging into the family backgrounds of these people, I mean, it's not just the great history that occurred at the time, be it the French Revolution or the war, the 7 Years' War, things like that. It was just digging into their backgrounds, how they lived. You walk down a corridor with the family portraits on either side, and you see these people looking at you, and you think, what were they like? How did they behave? What went on? You start to pick up a bit of knowledge about it. And also, I have also started this year as a town tour guide at Stamford in Lincolnshire. And Stamford itself is a very old town, but large parts of it are in fact Georgian. And they indeed have a Georgian festival in September where people from all over the world come over and have a week there dressing up as Mr Darcy. And in doing that, I started to pick up more about the architecture of the time and how things were put together and how they socialised and things of that nature. And from that, it opens up and you read a bit more. They're exciting people, they're colourful. A nice spirit of colour before the Victorian era arrived. And they were quite naughty as well, which is quite interesting.
No doubt we'll hear about that. So the name Georgian, Bill, where does the name Georgian come from?
It comes from the King Georges. The first King George I, came over from Hanover. He had a fairly remotish claim to the throne, but his one thing in his favour was he was a Protestant. And though he was German, he didn't speak English. He came over in 1714 and became George I. Then after that, he had George II, George III, and finally George IV, who was often known as Prince Regent. And so it ran roughly from about 1714 and in theory up to about 1830 when George IV died. But the thing was, from about 1811, sometimes it ceased being known as the Georgian period, became more like the Regency time. But technically speaking, it's named after four King Georges.
Okay, and also, can you just tell us a little bit about the background to the Georgian period, how it started, and what immediately went up to it?
Well, prior to that, you had the Stuarts, the monarchs of England. The last Stuart monarch was Queen Anne, who died childless in 1714. Even though she had about 13 or 14 pregnancies, none lived to any decent age, which is rather sad for her. But then after that, there was no heir, unless you looked at the King Jameses, who were Stuarts, but unfortunately they're exiles in France or the continent, because being Catholic, they'd been expelled from the country in 1689, and for being pretty useless apart from anything else. And so England would not be allowed to have a Catholic monarch. So they hunted around and they came up with the King George I, who was the Elector of Hanover, and he was selected, and he duly became King of England, and at the same time the Elector of Hanover. Hence the strong German connection of our royal family as today. In fact, oddly enough, if you look at, I was watching TV the other day and I saw Prince William chatting away, and if you look at him and you get out portraits of the King Georges, of the 1700s, there's a distinct family resemblance. In Grimsthorpe
Is there a
Castle,
similarity?
absolutely. If you have a look at it, you can see there's a portrait in Grimsthorpe Castle in one of the staterooms of George III on his coronation. And you look at his face, and you look at the face of King William, and there's a definite similarity. You see the size of the nose and the jowls, and again, if you look at the George II and first, you can see that family resemblance there. Another little thing, they seem to live for quite a long time. The four Georges actually, they lived for quite a while, well into the 60s and 70s, which in those days, and indeed in their 80s, and one of them, which in those days was pretty good going.
Yeah. So we've heard how long the period went on for. It was obviously between the Stuarts and the Victorian period.
Yeah.
What was life like for, should we say, a normal, not an aristocrat, not a really poor person, but an ordinary person living, let's say, in England? What was life like?
It could be worse. I mean, obviously, mortality was fairly high. If you manage to survive, your infanthood, then that's a good start. Even though if you're, say, middle class, like Jane Austen family, the sons of a rector or a curate, life was still fairly tenuous. You could be carried away with illness and disease. Indeed, Jane Austen herself died about 41 or 42 years of age. Things are improving all the time. Literacy was expanding an awful lot. You had the start of the novel. The writers like Defoe was coming on, and Richardson, Fielding, and then you got with Sir Walter Scott and indeed Jane Austen herself. So you had more interesting things to read. For a upper middle class person, you had probably a good social life, in as much the assembly rooms were starting up, so you could go to balls. Theatres were thriving fairly well. And if you're a young gentleman of a sporting fame, you could go cockfighting or other more, or fox hunting or racing. So I won't paint a rosy picture, but it wasn't too bad. By and large, at the beginning of the Georgian period, it was also a rural time as well. The vast bulk of people would have been involved on the land. But we've got to bear in mind, this is the start of the Industrial Revolution. So as the years went by, you had the start of the Industrial Revolution. You had canals being built. You had improvement in road communications as time went by, when they improved the communication by road, started surfacing better, things like that. And the whole country, then you had the move to the towns because industry was starting to develop, be it the cotton industry or coal or shipbuilding. And then you had a more of an urban population starting to build up. So a bit of a contrast between the rural ones, which would have been the Jane Austen types of the lovely ladies wandering around their empire gowns, snipping rose heads and things like that, to living in a town in north of England. It was a time of huge change. And also about this at the time, you had the massive expansion of London. At the beginning of the Georgian period, London might have had 100 or 150, 200,000 population. By the end of it, it's over 1 million. By far and away the largest city in Europe. And that had a big contrast. London in itself, as it is today, is a whole different world to the rest of the nation.
And what was before the Industrial Revolution then, at the sort of first part of the Georgian period, what was the population? What sort of levels of population did
If we just take England, you're probably looking about 5-6 million, if that sort of level, England. But then you have add on things like Ireland, because Ireland was a part of the United Kingdom at the time, and indeed in 1801, I think it was, they the Parliament merged with England, and that had a pretty sizable population. And you stick Scotland on top. So if you're talking, say, about the Napoleonic times, about 1800, you're looking about 15 million.
And I guess this was the time that the British Empire, started to really expand, was it, Bill?
Absolutely, yes. It really was the big build-up. You have the time opens up with this War of the Spanish Succession, which ended just at the start of the Georgian period, and we gained a few things from that. And as time went by, it was noted with virtually continuous warfare with the French. Ending in 1815 with the defeat of Napoleon. And you had the great wars of the 7 Years' War, where we ended up beating the French, as we should do, and we gained North America. Well, we kept the 13 colonies, but then obviously gained Canada, took that off the French.
Yeah.
We conquered India effectively with Clive's victories, and also
so we do have quite a bit of history with the French, don't we? It still carries on today. That
bit of friendly rivalry,
competitiveness.
So and of course, so it was what you call the first British Empire. The first British Empire would meaning basically that the first British Empire ended with the loss of the American colonies, and that's what we termed up to the first British Empire. Then after that, after a bit of a lull, we started to build up again, fight the French again, virtually over 20 years of the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars, ending up in 1815, which is still within the Georgian time, still the reign of George III, with the big top dogs, not only against the French, but indeed possibly the world, with respect to our huge wealth with industry and the empire. Britain, for that time, was a top dog.
And how this is a controversial one, Bill. How important was the slave trade to the contribution of the success of the British Empire?
It was a major part of it, obviously a controversial part. And if you go to towns like Bristol or Liverpool or Glasgow, they certainly got a huge amount of wealth over that particular matter. It's obviously not a glorious part of our history, but then again, many nations in history have been involved with slaving one way or another, and indeed even to some time to today. It did contribute. The West Indian Islands were fabulously wealthy. Indeed, at one point in time, I think we were in negotiations at the end of the American War of Independence. I think, what's worth more, Barbados, one island, or the entire all of Canada? And it was felt that Barbados was far more valuable than Canada, because of the sugar trade, because sugar was very, very important. And the Georgians loved sugar, and indeed tobacco. If you take sugar, that was extremely popular in Georgian times. They have a bit of a sweet tooth. And it's hard to imagine this, but in Georgian times, people had really bad teeth. And that wasn't shown as a mark of disrespect or being. In fact, it is a mark of a bit of wealth, because it means you could afford to eat a lot of sugar and have rotten teeth.
So having rotten teeth was almost like a status symbol. Is that what you're saying?
I wouldn't go that far, but it wasn't exactly. It was the way of the world. So if you could imagine going to a nice assembly room ball be in London or a provincial town like Stamford, you'd assemble there for your ball. They'd have the ball in the assembly rooms. Normally they'd be done when it's a full moon, because you didn't have street lighting in those days, and you gather at your assembly room, so everybody would get all dolled up. So the chap will get his best wig and his best clothing on, and ladies will get dressed in their lovely frocks, put a bit of powder on, a bit of lead paint over your face, put a few beauty spots. Yes, put a few beauty spots on, stick your wig on, and then put in your false teeth, ready to woo the ladies. Or vice
what was
versa.
the point? What was the point of the wigs?
Basically, because somewhat due to hygiene. I wouldn't say people were deliberately dirty in those days, but water was hard to come by, because you didn't have piped water into your house. If you're an ordinary middle class person, then you might be lucky to have a pump or a well in your garden, or you might have to send the servants down the street to get water. And we've got to put our minds back to that. Simple things, basic things like water. If you want to have a bath, it's a bit of a pain, because you've got to go and get your servants, if you're lucky to have servants, to come and fill up your bath, and that could take quite some time. So obviously people bathed less, and if you had long hair, then really it could get quite itchy and infected. So basically what most middle class men would do, they'd shave their head and put a wig on. That's been a much easier thing, and that persisted right through the Georgian era up until the end, when, as a result of the wars in France getting very expensive, they put a tax on wig powder in 1795.
A tax on wig powder.
Yep.
Okay.
Called a guinea tax on wig powder to the household.
So that's where the name guinea came from, is it?
Oh, let me finish. Yeah. So, and that, with the wig powder tax going in, it altered the men's hairstyle fashions. because some of them decided, I'm not paying that tax. And they then basically just had shorter hair. And they cut their hair short. And they used to call it the mode style à la guillotine, because prior to the aristocrats being guillotined in the French Revolution, they used to have the hair cut very short. And therefore, that's what gentlemen would do. And those men would also class themselves as the Whig type, whereas the Tories, they would carry on wearing their wigs, and they're a different political party. They carry on wearing their wigs, and a lot of those people would have been the ones who would be like the lawyers or the judges or the higher class people, and they were sometimes known as the big wigs.
I see. So that's where it came from.
Indeed they're sometimes known as the guinea pigs, because they're prepared to pay the guinea tax.
Okay.
There's loads of expressions you get from Georgian times, and they had taxes on so many things, and so I find it quite an interesting time, because even dull topics like taxes can be made interesting.
Tell us all about the taxes then, Bill.
Yeah, well, back in those days we had almost constant war with the French, particularly when you get to the Revolutionary Wars of the 1790s and the Napoleonic Wars that followed on. Britain was the bankroller for the wars. Yes, we had a navy, big navy, not a huge army, and we fought against the French first with the revolutionaries and then against Napoleon, and that's very expensive. And what we did, we also subsidised all the other countries to fight for us. We paid a fortune to the Austrians and the Prussians to actually do the fighting for us, which was nice of them. And so they needed constant money. So loads of taxes. Like, for example, you had obviously the one we're quite well aware of is the window tax. That actually started before the Georgian era. And basically, if you had more than 6 windows in your property, you're liable to a tax. And therefore, you walk around many English towns now, you'll see houses with bricked up windows. And that's the window tax. That actually lasted until the 1850s. But then you had a tax on snuff. In those days, you had powdered tobacco, and people would sniff it to clear the nose, and it was it's called snuff. And so you had a tax on that, and that was called, people could describe it as paying through the nose, because you were taxed on sniffing. And then you had another one, you had a tax on bricks. So you had a tax on the number of bricks in your property. So then what people did after that was actually have larger bricks. So you see, as the years went by, you see larger bricks going into properties. That reduced the tax you've got to pay on it, and they'd be called cobs. And then you had the wig powder tax. You had taxes on hats and gloves, which are quite onerous, because wearing a hat was absolutely virtually a compulsion to be naked going out of the house without a hat. And you had things like wallpaper tax. They put a tax on wallpaper. Then people found a way around it. Basically, they put the wallpaper up but had nothing on it, and then they painted it afterwards themselves. So they got around the tax. And then finally, the most infamous one of all was income tax, which was introduced in 1799 as a temporary measure to help pay for the Napoleonic Wars. But clearly, it's not been that temporary. The thing is, I defend the Georgians here that. We go on about silly tax in wigs and stuff like that. We have VAT now. Tax is virtually everything.
So, Bill, tell us a little bit about the political system and voting during this period. What happened?
Oh, it's quite fun, really. You had at the time there were basically 2 political parties. You had the king as a constitutional monarch, and Parliament, and it ground down to about 2 main parties. One was called the Tories. They were a party of the landed gentry, the upper class, the Anglican Church, and they were what you might call the right-wing side. And then you had the other party called the Whigs, and they were the landed gentry, the aristocracy, but not quite so many clergy. It was an upper class thing. It was a middle class thing. And the voting was hugely limited, with maybe 1% of the population getting a vote.
Who was eligible to vote in those days?
Basically, you had to own a certain amount of land before you could vote.
So your average Joe couldn't vote?
Certainly not. No. You'd probably look at maybe 1-2% of the population could vote. It's a very, very small amount, and it might vary the qualifications between being in the countryside or being in the town. And it had huge anomalies. For example, you'd have the rotten boroughs.
Why is it called a rotten borough?
The rotten borough because of the corruption involved in it. Say Stamford had a population of about 3,000 or 4,000. 3,000 say, and it could elect 2 MPs. Elect being a very loose term, as they were appointed by the local aristocrat. Whereas Manchester or Birmingham, with populations in the latter half of the century of about 300,000 people apiece, could elect 1 single MP. We could have Old Sarum, a place in Wiltshire, which had the population of about 4 sheep, and that was allowed to elect an MP. And they're called Lofton because simply they are. The franchises just didn't work. So if you lived in Manchester, you didn't have your own MP. And that's simply because these boroughs and the MPs were formulated at the time of several hundred years before, when people lived in the country, and it's changed. Then you have the advent of the Industrial Revolution, where you have the rise of Glasgow and Edinburgh, Glasgow and Birmingham and Manchester, and the political system didn't keep up with the times, not until about 1832 when it was properly reformed. But elections are great fun. Obviously, I've got a particular interest in Stamford and following the elections there, and they were quite riotous affairs. It was nothing squeamish about it. Although the franchise was extremely limited, I think the population did like to have a good time, and corruption was quite rife. There was no secret ballot until 1868. Therefore, you stood in, by the hustings and cast your vote, and everybody would know which side you're voting for. So if, like in the case of a town like Stamford, the MP was more or less in the pocket of the local aristocrat, if he saw you voting against his nomination, as he owned the bulk of the town, you'd be evicted. So from your house. So it's very corrupt. Bribery is common. You just basically buy the votes off people, be it with money or huge amounts of alcohol. The populace, even though they may not have the vote, would enjoy a good riot. So quite usual to have a good old fight and a riot during the election.
And in terms of everyday life, food and drink, what sort of food and drink stuffs did people used to have?
Obviously, a lot less meat was consumed than we do these days. A lot more, if you're poorer, then a lot of your diet would be down to non-meat things. They consume interesting products were coming back onto the market. Things like pineapples are hugely valuable. And in fact, you see often little stone carvings of valuable pineapples in stately homes because, they were something special. Tea. The Georgians put tea on the map. That really can. That's expensive. And tea was very important. Think of the Boston Tea Party when, in the prior to the American War of Independence, they emptied the tea into the harbour at Boston, and tea was extremely fashionable. And if you went to an assembly room for your ball, and they normally have them about a monthly basis, then you'd have tea, not alcohol.
And coffee.
Coffee was for the coffee houses. Again, an expensive product. Coffee houses, would you imagine the likes of Dr. Johnson in his coffee house chatting away and building up his dictionary or whatever, and they were meant to be relatively reputable places, coffee houses, but a lot of the middle class would focus on tea. Then you had the sugar, as we discussed earlier, and if you say take like stately home, food generally wasn't hot. Food would have been quite often cold because if you're a duke in a house, your kitchens are going to be some distance away, and by the time it got to your table, it would be cold, and that was considered the norm. Not unusual.
We can go to the supermarket now and we can buy a bag of ice, for example. So I guess did they have access to ice in those days for drinks and things?
Yes.
Tell us about that, Bill.
Sorry, you and I would have access to ice because we're not quite in that social strata. No, they would have. If you say take, a lord of an aristocrat or someone extremely wealthy, they'd normally have say a thing like an ice house in their grounds in their estate. Yeah. So what would happen is they build this house, it's semi-submerged, and they dig it into the ground a bit, and they'd heap. They're like little beehives, the top of them, and then they put a roof in and then cover the whole lot with a mound of earth. And you do still see these in stately homes, and they're still there. And what they do in the winter time, when the lake froze up that they got in the ground, or the servants would cut the ice, take it from the frozen lake, put it into the ice house, and seal it all up, and that could last for months. We have to bear in mind that winters were a lot harsher in those days. In the 1790s, they were especially harsh, and the Thames would freeze over on a regular basis, and they'd have fairs there. So it doesn't seem as ridiculous then as it does now. That would last well into the summer, indeed.
What ways did they have for preserving food?
Salt or smoking. Yeah, there's no other way. Or put a really good smelly spice on to hide the taste of the disgusting putrid meat.
One of the things that always comes up, which I find quite interesting, is this access to alcohol, in the belief that if you were somebody working in the fields, you would give your kids and you'd have yourself some beer, because the water was not wise to drink. Is that, how much truth is there in that?
Yeah, total truth. They didn't really drink water.
Right.
No, it would be beer. For something like that, for family, children, whatever, you have small beer. So that'd be sort of weak beer. But if you lived in the countryside, you might go down to a stream and get water. But in the towns there, you don't really have access to much of it. You maybe go to a pump in the street.
It's amazing how many of these sayings we talk about now. You just mentioned small beer. Is that where it came from?
Yes, yeah. And that's where you'd have your lunch. You're around, or indeed, it depends what part of the country you were. If you're in, say, Somerset or Devon, you'd have cider.
Small cider.
You'd have cider by the bucket load. And so, people would drink beer. And you'd have, most pubs would be brew their own. And quite often, up until the Victorian times, you've been a bit more of a beer man than me, brewing was done by women. More so than when it changed in the Victorian times when it became a man's thing, but quite often it was brewed by women.
So they didn't drink much water, or they didn't drink any water. Is that what you're saying?
Pretty dodgy to drink water in those days. Yeah. If I lived in the middle of London, would you really want to drink water? I mean, even right into the Victorian times, the cholera outbreaks that occurred in the Victorian times were immense. I mean, Prince Albert died of it, and that's well after the Georgians. So no,
and they would. They would tend to drink beer in the evening as well, I guess.
If you're poor, if you're rich, you drink wine.
So if you're poor, let's assume
smuggled in brandy from the smugglers.
Right. So let's assume you're poor. You work hard all day, either in the fields or in industry in the latter part of the period. You have a few drinks of beer during the day. You have some. You must have slept very well, I would have thought.
Well, you've got to bear in mind if it's light is an important thing, because you come home at night now and you put an electric light on. In those days, you're really restricted to, candlelight, and candles cost money.
When did gas lamps come in?
Gas lamps are more Victorian time.
Right.
At the end of the Georgian period, you had more oil lamps were coming into vogue. But if you take the average poor man, really, they can't afford to have lots of candles running at night. And they had different qualities of candles as well. So they'd have a cheap tallow candle, which would give off a lot of smoke and stink the place out as well.
Wars, we mentioned earlier. In the Stuart period, we had the Civil War that took place. Were there any civil type wars or disturbances during this period?
No, lots of them, yeah. If you take wars, the only civil wars that occurred would have been the two Jacobite rebellions of 1715 and more famous of 1745, and that was basically a civil war. Different parts of the country fighting that out. There's no internal revolution. We're very lucky not to have that. So you look at the French; they had their revolution.
Yeah. Just before we move on that, Bill, Jacobites. Yeah. What does that mean? Where does the name come from?
As you mentioned earlier, the Stuarts, the last Stuart one was Queen Anne, because she was a Protestant, but King James II was he was expelled from England in 1689 in the Glorious Revolution, when William of Orange came over. And with his English wife Mary, and they took over the throne, and they were Protestants, and basically you couldn't have a Catholic king after that, even to this day. So King James fled, and he fled with his family, and he had a son called James as well, and they lived in France, notably with the French king in exile, and because his name was James, they were called Jacobites. So that faction, ended up being called Jacobites after the name of James, and that carried on 1745 they were defeated at Culloden, and started to move out of history at that point in time. But you would have lots of good riots. I mean, the Georgians loved a riot, heaven's sakes. I keep going on about Stamford, that's because I'm no familiar. They had a lovely riot in 1734 over the election there, like a right bloodied riot where, buildings were set on fire. Indeed, the Jacobites had a riot in Stamford and burnt down several buildings. And then, of course, you had the mob in London was ferocious. The Gordon riots in London, which are anti-Catholic riots in the late 1700s. I mean, the whole town was shut down for about a week. With great loss of life. There was always that great fear of the mob. The politicians in the back of their mind had to fear the mob because that could rise up and cause problems.
Well, yeah, it's not surprising when as you said earlier, 1% of the population are entitled to vote. I can see how the mob became quite infuriated.
No, I think they just liked a good fight, that was all.
Did they?
Yeah. I don't think any intellectual thing came into it somehow. So we'll have a riot, do a bit of looting, and get really, really drunk.
Okay.
But no, it was quite rumbustious times, and I think probably politicians in the back of their mind had to bear that in mind with the mobs. They do have to placate them every now and again, and not go over the top. But towards the end, around the French Revolution time, things did get quite repressive, though, because the powers that be were extremely nervous of revolution, and they did mete out. Lots of repressive laws were coming in, and they had one or two executions to keep people in tow. I mean, indeed, the last man to be hung, drawn, and quartered in Britain was actually during the time of the beginning of the Napoleonic Wars, about 1782. Sorry, about 1782, where a clerk in the Admiralty in the Navy, he gave away secrets to the French, and he was found guilty of treason, and he was the last man to be hung, drawn, and quartered in England.
And for people who aren't familiar with what hung, drawn, and quartered is, Bill, can you explain what that is?
It's actually it's the execution for being a traitor. It's the traitor's death, and in old and we use the wrong expression of it now, because it's we say hung, drawn, and quartered. No, what you do, you were drawn. You were taken from the prison, and you were drawn on like a wooden board through the town, lying on your back, so the population could jeer at you and shout at you and what have you. And you were drawn to your place of execution. You were hung by your neck. Now, in the early days, medieval times and up into Stuart times, you're hung for a very, very short time, and then you were cut down, and they chop your body into quarters. And I think but it was slightly different. They did other things, unfortunately, to you beforehand, before you chop your body up as well. So it's not a very pleasant death indeed. That persisted right the way up. And if you bear with me, there's a lovely quotation I've got about the execution of in 1782 of Mr Tyree, David Tyree, who was the chap who spied. And by that time, they did it slightly differently. So I'll just read this for a quote. The crowd of people of all ranks assembled by 4 o'clock this morning at the gates of the jail to see Tyree set off for the place of execution, and the crowd was very great. About 5 o'clock, he was put into a coach with 6 horses, attended by the ordinary under-sheriff, jailer, etc., and conveyed to Portsmouth, where he was being delivered to the mayor and police of the town. He was drawn on a sledge to the place of execution. After praying a little time, he was turned off and hanged until almost dead. Was then cut down, his head severed from his body, his bowels taken out, and his heart shown to the surrounding multitude, and then thrown into a fire made for that purpose. The body was then quartered and put into a coffin. The concourse of people was immense, and such was the singular avarice of many who were near the body, that happy was he who could procure a finger or some vestige of the criminal. Absolutely charming. But that was he was okay at the time because he was virtually dead when they started they cut off his head. But years before that, it was deliberately done to prolong it as long as possible. And then after that, he still had that sentence of drawn and quartered. But after they didn't bother. They just hung you. That's it.
Yeah. So that happened at the end of the 18th century.
1782.
So really not that long ago. About
not that long ago.
I say
the sentence still carried on for another few years, but they dispensed with the chopping up. They just hung you, and that was it, and maybe chopped your head off and you're dead.
We see it as quite barbaric, and yet it's only just over 200 years ago.
That's right. Well, the last woman to be burned at the stake was also about that sort of time.
In the Georgian times?
Yeah. In 1789, a lady called Christian Bowman, she was not found guilty of treason. She was found guilty of counterfeiting. She actually did counterfeit coinage and put the king's head on the coin, which is considered a treason offence because she was sort of, abusing the king's head. And she was actually taken from Newgate to the scaffold, and she was hung up, and the stool was kicked away from underneath her, and she was hung and left hanging for half an hour. She was just dead, and then they piled faggots around her and set fire to them. So, although she was burned at the stake, it wasn't the way things, she was dead at the time, and that was ceased afterwards. They stopped doing that. So you were getting to a stage where you had these things were fairly tough, but they were moving away from cruelty. I mean, at that time, you could be hung for anything of 220 crimes. So, so basically, it was a capital. There were 220 crimes which had a capital offence. Yeah. So if you stole goods worth more than a shilling, then you could face a death penalty. Wow. It sounds harsh, but people weren't as cruel as we think, because what would happen quite often is the juries, say someone sold £10 worth of goods, when the jury did it and the courts did it, they'd suddenly find out the value of the goods was worth about 5p. So, so instead of the person being hung, they'd often be transported to be it America or latterly Australia. So they weren't as nasty as we think. No. There was a degree of compassion. Obviously, there were certain judges who were hanging judges, but there was a degree of compassion coming forward. Yeah. And they were starting to do things like, in the early part of the Georgian period, in London, the execution point was Tyburn. And then you'd be drawn along towards
Tyburn.
Tyburn. Yeah. So you'd be taken from Newgate down, taken in a car to Tyburn, and there you were hung. But you were hung by being pulled up slowly, so you were strangled. Yeah. But after that, they moved it to a different place in the latter part of the Georgian time. And instead of being strangled, that's when you had the drop, where you were, you were stood on top of the scaffold, a trapdoor was dropped down and you fell or whatever. Yeah. But there's interesting things all about hanging, if I may go forward on it. You say, for example, you take the executioner would hang you, and he'd have the right to have the rope afterwards of the hanging. And that rope was considered quite precious by the population for very superstitious reasons. And so what the hangman would do, he'd cut up bits of rope and he'd sell them to the spectators. And that's where you get the expression money for old rope.
Another one of your expressions, Bill.
Yeah, and another one goes with hanging. There's a lot about that because it's a popular pastime at the time, watching a hanging. When they were drawn by the cart on the way to Tyburn, for example, if it's a really popular criminal, and there were popular criminals going for hanging, and they put on a good show, like Jonathan Wild, Highwayman and things like that, and they'd be drawn along, and as they went by each pub, often the publican would come out and give them drink, brandy or whatever happened to be to the criminal. And then by the time they get to the place of execution, the criminals had a whole shed load of alcohol. And that's when they take him off the wagon, ready for execution. That's when you get the phrase, "I've come off the wagon."
The wagon. Another one. Bill.
Here's another one. You want to know? Should we go for it?
Oh, yeah. We're getting going now, Bill.
And then you get the expression that, as I said, in the early days, they were pulled up and strangled. And if what you would do to help hasten death, so you have the person hanging up from the rope, to help hasten death, their friends or relative would come along and hang on to their ankles to pull them down to hasten death. And that's where you get the expression hangers on.
Ah, right. Another one.
I know it's good
You could
times.
have
Eh?
we could have a whole episode about you talking about where these sayings
Oh,
come
you could
from.
do it. It's a massive
Yeah,
event. The crowds were huge. If ever you go to the likes of places like Lincoln Castle,
yeah.
on top of one of the turrets, highest point around, they'd set up the gallows there, and you'd have tens of thousands of people come around to watch a good execution.
So this was the equivalent of going to see Manchester United at Trafford or something.
Yeah, 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 and you always get the result you want. So it's
There was only one
interesting.
result.
Only
Yeah,
one result, but no, the colourful times, colourful
yeah.
times.
Colourful times. Now, talking about colour, what about things like art? I mentioned a bit earlier on. You've got Gainsborough and Constable. Big time for art, was it?
Absolutely, absolutely. I don't pretend to be an art historian in any way,
No.
but I have been interested with doing the jobs I've done to, you know, get involved with that. My lord's been around portraiture because being a guide in a stately home, there's loads and loads of portraits there and of the
Yeah.
family members basically, and those are the ones I particularly like. And you'd
Yes.
have obviously Joshua Reynolds was the classic one. He was around at the time. He painted the good and the great. Another one was Sir Thomas Lawrence. He was at the latter part of the 1790s into the early 1800s, and he painted fantastic pictures. You could see them, and you could see how modern they look. And he was a great portraiture. And he had Thomas Hudson as well, a great portraiture, because portraits were the photographs of the time,
Yeah.
and they really mattered. And it was a bit of an industry, really. For example, you take the portraits of George III, his coronation portrait. You'll see it quite often in many places. That was done by a chap called Ramsay. Now, Ramsay did the initial portrait. Then he had a production line of apprentices and minor artists who just copied them. And, so you
Yeah.
take the coronation one of George III, there's about 120 copies of it. And so it was quite a production machine. So the artist might do the face, say, the tough
Yeah.
bits, and the apprentices and the followers on would put in the arms and the hands. So sometimes you get a nice looking face and really rubbish looking hands. But I don't pretend to be an art historian.
No.
And at that time, you got my favourite. Of course, you got the landscapers like Constable, Gainsborough. I love Gainsborough. I'd love to see the portrait of Gainsborough that he does with the people there, with the ladies in particular, with their lovely hairdos of the 1770s and 80s, huge hairdos, and their lovely clothing is absolutely magnificent. My favourite one is actually both an artist and a poet. Is William Brooke Blake is my favourite poet. I studied him I did from A level at school, and he's fabulous. And his paintings and pictures are really quite Gothic or modern looking in some respects.
Yeah.
So it was a time of it's a time of the Enlightenment, time of the Enlightenment, moving on from the pseudo medieval times into a new world. Hence the Georgian architecture. And if you look at Georgian architecture, it's very classical. They're rediscovering the classical architecture of ancient Rome and Greece, and indeed parts of Egypt as well. And so if you look at Georgian property, the front of it will be great Doric or Corinthian columns. And
So, Bill, just for those that don't know about Enlightenment, can you just enlighten us a bit on what the word Enlightenment meant at the time, please?
yeah, the Enlightenment was really like an explosion in education, art, sciences, philosophy, which occurred from about the 1730s, 1740s onwards, and it's been known as the Enlightenment. And that's when you get a great splurge in philosophy, like people like Voltaire, Hume, and you have the creative art starting up. There's also a reconnection with the classics. So if you take Georgian architecture of the 18th century, you notice that the frontages are, like great Doric columns from Greece or Corinthian columns or Roman things. And it was just reconnecting with the classics. And if you bear in mind, say, the previous century, the 1600s, it was full of religious strife and torment. You had Cromwell, you had the 30 Years' War. And I think they're getting away from that and just exploring, just moving away from purely the Christian side of things and just opening up to the world. And hence you had that expression, enlightenment. And it's a thing of Western Europe, really, not so much for other parts of the world.
So on the architecture side, what sort of towns in England, Wales and Scotland would you say people could have a look at and see some of that evidence of the architecture that goes back to the Georgian time?
Well, obviously you've got Bath. I mean, that's your classic Jane Austen type, lots and lots of Georgian architecture. But other places are very important. Is in other words, Edinburgh, because Scotland had a huge enlightenment. It moved from a very backward, primitive, poverty-stricken country to one at the forefront of education and the arts and sciences. And likes of James Watt, and you had Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations. You had Hume. You had the architectures, the Adam brothers, and in Edinburgh, it's got a whole section called the New Town, which is basically a Georgian new town constructed outside the old medieval part. Edinburgh's very good. Another city, and we're not just restricted to Great Britain here. The other city to have a lot is Dublin. Dublin has a very, very considerable Georgian section, which is quite impressive, and that's worth seeing. Then you've got your other places like Leamington Spa, the spa towns, and Harrogate, and obviously another one I'll boast as well is Stamford as well, which has got lots and lots of Georgian architecture and lots of Georgian features about it. Indeed, in September time they have a week-long Georgian festival. Whether that will occur this year or not with all this pandemic, who knows?
Just before we wrap up, Bill, what legacy have the Georgians left us?
I think that, to me, it's the foundation of the modern era.
Yeah.
The start of the industrial world. If we take England, or Britain rather, in the British Isles and the United Kingdom in particular, the legacy would be the start of the Industrial Revolution. If you think in our lovely, comfortable modern world, the most significant thing that's occurred in the last 250 years has been the move away from the agrarian economy into the world of industry. If we hadn't done that, then we wouldn't be sitting here doing this podcast, because it would be all much more primitive. So I would probably think the Georgian part would have been that flurry of education, the start of industry, the moving away from maybe the old pure religious types to new flourishing arts. The starts of novels. I mean, novels didn't really exist before that time. So you had the Walter Scotts, Jane Austens, the Daniel Defoes of this, or the Fieldings. To me, it's the beginning of what I would term the modern world.
Yeah. So you had basically a period of just over 100 years that set it up for the modern world as we see it today, I guess.
Yes, yeah. It does. With still traces of a more primitive lifestyle, shall we say, as well. But a lot of that's due to the times you lived in. We're used to comfortable things, electricity, piped water, and things like that. If you had to wash your clothes on a regular basis and you can't get hold of water and that, you can't cook because you don't have a kitchen, life is a lot different.
Bill, this has been a great conversation. If people want to find out more about the Georgians and, in fact, more about what you do with your tour guide, where should they go?
There's lots of literature available about the Georgians that you can read up upon. There's also some good novels to try out and have a look at. The likes of Tom Jones by Fielding, or Joseph Andrews by Fielding again, or Clarissa by Samuel Richardson, or Joseph Andrews rather by Samuel Richardson. It's a lot of those are quite roll-up-in little novels to work your way through. And again, there's lots of Georgian architecture still around all over the place. It's hard to get away from in some respects. But literature-wise, there's lots and lots and lots which is out there.
We can put some of that stuff on the show notes for people to hear about. And what about your touring, your tour guide of Stamford? Tell us a bit about that.
Well, unfortunately, because of the shutdown and lockdown, I'm not doing any at the moment. I work with a group of 3 or 4 others, and we're known as the Mayor's Guide. And I take people for a tour of Stamford Town, on a walking tour, that is. So it takes about an hour and 15 minutes. And during that tour, there'll be a lot about the Georgians, because Stamford has a lot of Georgian architecture. Not only that, it's got things like assembly rooms. You can discuss all about how people behaved. It's got coaching inns. It's very much a Georgian town, but also there's a lot of medieval history about Stamford as well. There's still lots of medieval properties about, and it's just full of history. Be it the elections or the bull running or all sorts.
Thanks ever so much for your time today. This has been a very interesting conversation, and stay safe.
And you. Thanks a lot.
thanks go to today's guest, Bill Cunningham, historian and tour guide from the Stamford Mayor's Guides. I really enjoyed that conversation, and I hope, like me, you found the subject very interesting. You have been listening to Undercurrent Stories. I hope that you enjoyed the show. Please subscribe to the show for future episodes, and if you like what you hear, please share the show link to your friends and family. And if you have 60 seconds, I'd be most grateful if you would please rate and review. Please check out our webpage and social media links where details can be found on the show notes. Until next time, this is Bob Wells, wishing you all the very best.